So let's begin today by talking about Old Testament law, which is the second installment in our five-part installment for this particular course. The different genres. We're looking at the different genres in the Old Testament. And genre is important, as I've tried to establish last week, because the nature of the genre will determine how you read text from that particular genre, and then as a result, our applications flow out of a better understanding of how to read that particular genre. So I hope as we come week by week, we will be able to, to have different shades of understanding. Okay, different shades of understanding, have a bit more nuanced in our understanding of Scripture, because it's not like one big thing. It's divided into different types, and different types require you to respond differently, right? And to have a different sort of perspective with every shade that you come across, right? And encounter. So that's really our goal today. And so what I want to do today is perhaps to start with a question. This question will be, which of the following Old Testament laws do we adhere to, and which ones do we ignore, or we avoid, or we sidestep, or we break, or we consider irrelevant? Okay, so that's the question, and that's the question. And I'm going to be showing us some verses. Now, those of you who have already received the PowerPoint ahead, and that's why sometimes I don't like to share PowerPoint, because you see everything I read. All my surprises you all can see already. Right? So, the verses are, do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Later on, maybe during the break or later on, remind me to share with you a story I had with a rabbi and his family, because when I was staying in UK, I was a student in the UK, I was involved in an exchange program, right? And how they practice this particular law. Okay, do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. The third one, a woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son will be ceremonially unclean for seven days. Okay, specifically 7 days. A man who has lost his hair and is bald is clean. Amen? Make tassels on the four corners of the cloak that you wear. Okay, I don't see any of you with tassels around. You can't be very good Christians. A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing. Stand up in the presence of the aged. Hey, why are you all sitting down? Stand up in the presence of the aged. Do not put tattoo marks on yourselves. The pig is also unclean. Although it has divided hoof, it does not chew the curd. You are not to eat their meat or touch their carcasses. Anybody a pork butcher around here? Okay, and then love your neighbor as yourself. You shall not murder, and you shall not commit adultery. Okay, so as we've gone through this list, and as I presented the list to you all, I think most of us will agree that we take the last three laws very seriously, and then the others maybe not so seriously, except for one or two exceptions, which are normally linked to our personal convictions, right? Or it's linked to church teaching, maybe about tattoo and maybe about cross-dressing, depending on the church, or our reactions to negative cultural associations like tattoo, right? I mean, your grandmother would, or your mother, if you're older, would react so strongly if anybody with a tattoo is in your presence, right? Because of the negative cultural associations. Or some sort of self-imposed restriction for the sake of missions. So I know friends, they love pork, but when they do missions in maybe a more Muslim like country, they don't eat pork for the sake of being with the people, or even with Jewish people, right? So if we say that the word of God is true and it is to be obeyed in full, then the question is, why this double standard? Okay, why this double standard? So let me leave us a quote from Duval and Hayes, because you remember that Duval and Hayes is the basic textbook that we will be using for this 4 sessions that we're going to have together. So Duval and Hayes, what they say is, so why do we adhere to some laws and ignore others? Which laws are valid and which are not? Many Christians today are baffled by the interpretive problem of the law. Some of us take the problem of the approach of simply skimming through the legal text, skimming over all the laws that do not seem to apply to us. And it's kind of like wishy-washy, it's like, kind of random. And these laws that we choose to ignore, altogether. Then, when we encounter one that does seem to make sense in today's world, we grab it and we underline it and we use it as a guideline for living. Surely this willy-nilly approach to interpreting the Old Testament law is inadequate. How should we interpret the law? And that's really the question that all of us coming here are asking, right? And they go on to say that in this chapter, we will learn a consistent approach to interpreting the Old Testament law. We will first discuss a popular traditional approach that we consider inadequate. Then we will present the method we feel is most valid for interpreting the law. As part of our suggested approach, we will first explore the narrative and the covenant context of the Old Testament legal material and discuss the implications of that context to interpretation. Then we will apply the interpretive journey to the task of interpreting the law, providing several examples. Now, because of time, I've chosen not to spend time looking at the journey, but actually that is a very, very good last step for us to take. I think many of you have got the copy of the book, so maybe I'll just leave it to you to work through that last bit. Okay, because I think you do have the resources to go back and work it through for yourself or as a group. Okay, so because you all have that shared resource. Now, what is this popular traditional approach that churches and church leaders very often teach that is mentioned to us by Duval and Hayes? Now, the approach basically divides all the laws in the Old Testament into 3 categories. And the 3 categories are moral, so they are either moral, or they are civil, or they are ceremonial laws. Okay, moral laws, civil, or ceremonial laws. So, moral laws basically are defined or were defined as those that dealt with timeless truths regarding God's intention for human behavior, such as love your neighbor as yourself. That's a very good example of the so-called moral law, okay, under that category. And the civil laws were those that describe aspects that we normally see in a country's legal system. Now, these laws deal with the courts, economics, land, crimes, punishment, etc. So an example of civil law that we find is in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 1. At the end of every 7 years, we must cancel debt. Now, this is the civil law. It was the law in operation in the nation at that time. But for that country, right, for that particular political entity, okay, which may not be our political entity, right? So hence civil law, right? So every country will have its set of civil laws, as you would know, right? If you travel across, for example, if you go to Thailand, if you say something bad about the king, you are liable to be jailed or even maybe something even worse, right? So that civil law is unique to Thailand. but it's not unique to the rest of the world. Okay, so I wanted you to see what civil law, understand what civil law is all about. And then we have ceremonial laws, those that deal with sacrifices, festivals, priestly activities. And for example, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 13 instructed the Israelites to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days before, after you have gathered and produced your threshing, gathered the produce of your threshing floor and your wine presses. Okay, so again, every law, every country will have its ceremonial laws. And you remember that as Israel entered into the land also had their sets of ceremonial law. Okay, so as we enter into any country, I mean, I've just come back from Taiwan, and the one thing I was reminded again, really in my face, because I was there during a very high festival kind of a period, and early the whole day we will see religious laws and religious practices being enacted, very in your face, very loud. All the five senses, maybe even your sixth sense, was all of them were activated. Right? So smoke la, sound la, everything except for taste, because I didn't taste any except for the good food, but not related to the festival. But even the spiritual sense, sometimes you can kind of feel, So all I'm saying is that every country will have its ceremonial laws. And I also want us to begin to think about it. Why am I sharing all this, right? Because as I just said a moment ago, when Israel entered into the land, it also had its sets of ceremonial laws. Now, remember one thing, if you are migrating into a different country, right? You are Singaporean speaking Singlish, right? If you go live in another country, after a while you will be a little bit more like them, right? Our children, when we send them over to the US, they come back, they come speaking a language that you may not totally understand. They call it American English, right? College level, college version of American English. And the practices that they have imbibed in themselves, very different. Now think about it. What is the implication of what I'm saying right now? Right? Ceremonial laws, civil laws, all these are actually not just necessarily taught in classes. Right? It's not a cognitive download. It's very often a down-up kind of a assimilation and acculturation. Okay? So the influence is not necessarily through teaching, but by what people see, experience, and are maybe even pressured to practice. All right? Pressured to practice. So that there can be some interesting implications as we go through and study the law. Okay? Now, this is all extra for free, no extra charge. What I just shared with you all. But I'm actually talking about, the three kinds of laws. The traditional approach to moral, civil, and ceremonial law that they're trying to debunk, right? So Duval and Hayes are trying to debunk that. Now, and they go on to say that the thing about this approach is that it goes on to say that since moral laws are timeless and they are universal, they are applicable and they are relevant for all times and all the time, right? And since civil laws are culture-bound to the life of ancient Israel, right, then they are no longer applicable for us as New Testament or post-New Testament Christians. I assume all of us here are Christians, right? Now, the same can be said for ceremonial laws. Okay, so moral laws are okay, but the same can be said for ceremonial laws. Now, they were ancient laws, rites and rituals and practices under the old covenant, but now we live under the new covenant. So it doesn't apply anymore. So can you see what's happening? Only the moral law applies. The rest of it we can discard. We don't have to bother with that. Now, scholarship over the years, we have moved away from this very, very unsatisfactory way of dealing with Old Testament law. What this traditional approach has helped us to do is to conveniently sidestep, to conveniently devalue and pronounce as irrelevant a whole body of valuable teaching from the Bible. Now, framing it this way doesn't allow Christians to affirm some of the valuable theological principles which are embedded in some of the civil as well as the ceremonial laws. It also allows Christians to cherry pick civil or ceremonial laws which fuel popular trends. For example, shofar blowing in gatherings, right? We have this is the ram's horn shofar. Shofar show good? And this is the kudu horn shofar. So I've asked Pastor Joe, I really like Pastor Joe's horn. It's really, really nice, right? Yeah. For me, I come to a certain age when I have to put it in my ear. But I've asked him to share. I mean, okay, this is going to be a sidebar, not really related to the class, but I thought I'd just pique your interest. But this shofar, maybe just bring it back one. So this shofar is the kudu horn shofar, and I think many people don't realize that this is not the typical horn that they would use in Jewish ceremonies, because this is a kudu horn one, okay? The one that they use is actually the ram's horn one. So that's actually considered more authentic. Okay, but since we have the kudu horn here, is it okay if I attempt to blow one? I've not done this in a long time. One thing I say to you, if you go back to Israel again, you want to buy one of these things, beware. I tell you where. Why? Because I've done this before. I used to be a carouseller. And I used to put them on carousel because I used to go so often, right? So I bring them back. Now, if you put your nose into here, which is not what you're supposed to do, when you put your nose in here, right, you would have the most horrible experience. The experience of smelling dead flesh. Because basically it is chopped off from the top of somebody's head, and it smells. It really smells, and it takes about a year. You see vinegar all sorts of remedies to get rid of the smell. It doesn't work. I've tried it many times. Okay. But this one obviously has been around for a long time. I know because this is the same one that I've blown over the years from Pastor Joe. Okay, and just from a musician point of view, okay, if any of you are familiar with overtones, right? When you can blow da, and then the next octave da da. Now you can blow these in different intervals, right? And that's why you can use a bugle, and you can play all those interesting tunes. They're all in 1, 5, the fifth and things like that. So I mean, there's a bit of a musical science behind it lah. Okay, so this one, I'm gonna have to wet my lips to do it. Okay, so give me a moment. Preparation. It's the same for blowing what we call the Australian didgeridoo. After that, I have to clean this for hygiene reasons. So actually not so difficult to blow now. Did you hear that? Now, if I was more skilled, I haven't played a shofar in a long time. But if I'm more skilled, I can actually make it go up, if I have the proper lip training. Okay, so it's actually not very difficult to blow. But okay, I'm doing all this not so much to interest you in the shofar, because I know a lot of people are very, 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 very interested in the shofar for religious reasons. And I'm here to make a point, and I'm blowing the shofar partly to help us to remember a point. Okay, so today, if you go back and you forget a lot of other things, just remember what I'm going to be sharing related to the shofar. Okay, so I was also I'm talking about, I'm using this to illustrate the point that people cherry pick our verses. Okay, so I'm saying that, there's a lot of Christian community. I think there is even a group in Singapore, maybe more than one group, where they all have got shofars, and then they, practice shofar blowing, etc., for church purposes. Okay, so I think there is a quite a popular trend of shofar blowing in gatherings. Right? In my own church, I've been the shofar blower, a reluctant one, because they wanted to call to worship or call to something, call to gathering. Okay, and the verse that I wanted to share with us was this one from Leviticus chapter 25, which says, then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement, you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land. Now you've heard the sound of one shofar blowing. And interestingly, shofars, depending on the length of it, will give you a different pitch. Right? So I can't remember what key this one is, but if it's done in C, somebody has got a shorter one, you can blow, it comes out as a D, or a B flat or something like that. So it will come out as different sounds. And of course, you can harmonize them, you can pick certain ones and you play them together. Right? So imagine you have 200 people with 200 shofar blowing. That's a loud sound. That's a very loud sound. Okay? And it's very, very, it's a very bodily experience, when you are in the presence of loud music, it really, really wakes you up, and it really moves you deeply inside. Okay. But I'm saying that if people blowing together and call people to come to do something, worship or gather, or let's go to war or whatever, it is something that is used. But I'm talking about cherry picking issue, right? So here we have, and sometimes people use verses like that, to justify the usage of shofar. But let's read the entire context of what Leviticus chapter 25 says. You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the So, there was a verse 8 before verse 9. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month, and on the day of atonement you shall sound the trumpets throughout all the land. That was the passage that we read in isolation earlier on. Let's read on. And you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of itself, nor gather the grapes from the undressed vines. For it is a jubilee year, it shall be holy to you, and you may eat the produce of the field. Now, we generally use verse 9, right? At the beginning of worship gatherings, but we don't go on to practice verses 10 to 12, right? So, you see what I'm trying to say? I'm saying that we cherry pick the parts of the passage that we want to use for our purposes, but we miss out what the other parts of the law tells us to do. Why is that so? The question is, why the double standard? Okay? So, I think the big problem with the popular tradition is that by making morality as well as, whatever allows, whatever fancy, you want to go by, as the only point of reference, then what happens is that it leaves Christians vulnerable to attack from critics who like to point out the arbitrary nature of our choices, right? The arbitrary morality of some of the civil laws. And then they're going to accuse Christians of not wanting to deal with the issues that we conveniently sidestep. So what happens is that we then cut off what I would call, what theologians often call theology in action. Right? We cut off that dimension of the Christian life and thinking. Right? We cut off discussions about Israelite law being a theological response, a righteous and radical counter alternative to what was found in the larger pagan culture. I mean, earlier on I said that there were ceremonial and civil laws and also moral laws in the culture that they were entering into. And Israel's law was meant to be understood as a theological response, a righteous and a radical counter-cultural alternative to what was going to be found in the larger pagan culture. So we cut off discussions about appropriate and reasonable contemporary appropriation of ancient texts. Right? So I'm pointing out that going this way is problematic. It's too simplistic. It's too convenient. We like to put everything into the nice little boxes, and as long as we can tick one box, we are fine with that. Okay, so there's a bit of a problem there. And so they leave us with the dilemma. How do we move forward? And what Duval and Hayes do is to introduce us to a more consistent approach to interpreting the Old Testament law by exploring, so this is the contents page of the chapter, exploring the narrative and the covenant context of Old Testament legal material, and then discussing the implications of that context for interpretation. Okay, so I'm going to be spending most of my time looking at narrative and covenant context, and also later on, if you run ahead of your slides, you will also see that I will be drawing from another book, Dr. Chris Wright's book, and we will just put the two ideas together. Okay, but before we even do those things, I want to introduce to us classification, the typical types of laws that we find in the Old Testament. I was going to do another exercise, which is to show to us where the major, what we call the corpuses, the body of law or legal material, can be found in the Old Testament. But I think I just didn't have, I thought through that. I actually removed that section because I think I don't have time to cover that. I will just kill the class with too much information at that point of time. Okay, so I think this is important. The two terms that are often used to classify different types of law, not just in the Old Testament, but even in modern practice, okay? So these are what we call apodictic law and casuistic law, okay? Apodictic and casuistic. There's two different types of law that we find. Now, I want to just quote a dictionary of the biblical studies, and it says, apodictic law is a form of law characterized by personal address in the form of the imperative mood. Don't let all that wordiness kill you. I'll explain it in more simple terms later. You shall not, okay? So usually there's no mitigating circumstances or details that are given. No consequences are specified. So, it's just a direct command, you shall not, or you shall not do this, you shall not, it's a direct address to the audience, right? And then the difference between that and casuistic law is the conditional case by case situation nature of casuistic law, right? A form of law characterized by if-then condition, where an action and its consequences are stipulated and the mitigating circumstances or considerations are specified. A biblical example is Exodus chapter 21, 12 to 13. Whenever a person strikes whoever strikes a person mortally shall be put to death. If it is not premeditated but came about by an act of God, then I will appoint for you a place to which the killer may flee. And hence, if you are familiar with the Old Testament, there are what we call cities of refuge. There were 6 cities of refuge. If you look at the Jordan River, there were 3 on one side and 3 on the other side. These are the cities of refuge where people could actually go to as safe havens, safe places, if there was such a situation where there was a killing situation, but it was not intentional. Right? So the person would run to that place and be kind of a safe haven for the person. Thank you. Now, one would expect, excuse me, one would expect that apodictic laws, you shall, not if, there's not an if-then situation. Now, so we would expect that apodictic laws are universal, universally accepted, self-explanatory. We don't need to make any reference to specific cultural context. We would expect that, but and so I was looking at the Bible.org website, and to the question, can you describe apodictic law as it applies to the Old Testament law? Interestingly, this is what it says. Apodictic law refers to timeless divine commands and not to law applied. Thus, it is necessarily and demonstrably true, incontrovertibly, clearly established, or beyond dispute, since it is divinely revealed. This is so because it is not directly related to any particular necessary historical situation. Thou shalt not, i.e. the 10 Commandments. So it is saying that apodictic law, no controversy, it is because it's from God, it's divinely appointed from God. It is always true under all historical space-time situations. Okay? So, because nowadays we have ChatGPT, I asked ChatGPT this question, kind of like challenging this position. So I asked ChatGPT this question: are there apodictic laws in your Old Testament that are considered problematic today? Okay, so I wanted to test the theory. That's what we do, right? And that's what our young people do too. And so we need to anticipate the questions. I'm helping us to anticipate the questions, right? So it gave me this answer in 5 seconds, right? Some apodictic laws in the Old Testament have been considered problematic. Oh no. And challenging, especially when viewed through modern ethical, cultural, and legal lenses. Here are a few examples. So it gives me Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18 to 21. The content, the law commands that a rebellious son who does not obey his parents, even after discipline, should be brought to the elders of the city and stoned to death. Any of you done that recently? And so he also points out to us the problematic aspects, the severity of the punishment, the potential for misuse or abuse, the harshness towards children are seen as extreme and incompatible with modern views of justice and parental discipline. Another one from Exodus chapter 31. Anyone who works on the Sabbath shall be put to death. Tomorrow is what day? Sorry, today is Saturday. Today is the Sabbath. The Jewish Sabbath. Oh my goodness, what am I doing working? I'm going home now. Okay, because I will put to death. Okay, so again, the severity, etc. Leviticus chapter 20, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. Maybe people say, yeah, lah, should lah, but wow, that is a bit, we would say in our modern sensibilities, we will feel that that's a bit strong, right? And then Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 20 to 21, if a bride is found not to be a virgin, she shall be stoned to death. Not just stoned to death at her father's doorstep. Okay, meaning the family is involved in the killing. Wow, And then we move on to, ChatGPT goes on to say that these laws reflect the cultural and historical context in which they are written, and their interpretation and application have evolved over time. Many contemporary religious communities approach these texts with a focus on the underlying principles, the historical context, and the need for compassionate and just application of moral teachings. Now, at this point, I would agree with ChatGPT that, if we think, okay, we were trying to dismantle the moral, civil, ceremonial model. Now I mentioned to you apodictic and casuistic, and I'm saying that, the claims are apodictic are timeless, universal, always above culture, and there is the casuistic. Then we can be a bit lighter on the casuistic, but I really wanted to do this exercise with all of us to help us to be awakened to wooden applications. So I give you these fancy labels, and then, after that you use them, but you can also misuse them or use them with maybe not proper understanding. So I'm trying to raise all these issues for us right at the beginning of our session in order for us to be aware that it's not an easy body of Old Testament literature and teaching to deal with. We can't just apply woodenly without thought. Okay? So, it's for these reasons that I want to point out these issues, because I want us to be aware that woodenly saying that apodictic laws are universal without looking at context, I think is problematic also. Okay? So it is true that apodictic laws do make absolute demands, but it is also necessary to try to figure out why the law existed and for what particular historical context. And then from there, to draw out theological principles where we can apply, use to apply. Okay, the same for casuistic law. Okay, the same for casuistic law that apply only under appropriate conditions. Right? So one of my favorites would be the goring of the ox. Okay, so the ox, gores a person to death. Now we don't have any oxen around, so that one is not applicable because it's a rural law. It's only applicable for rural society. But if you look around the different conditions, it's very interesting to see how you can draw a theological principle or social protection principle and then extend it to our culture. Maybe that has got to do with biting dogs unleashed, right? Because maybe that's more a modern application of that. Okay, certain kinds of dog breeds are more prone to. Although I would, so we've also been following the pit bull culture and all that, and I realized that actually, just to say that all pit bulls are, just because they have a certain tendency, to say all pit bulls are killer dogs, I think it's also wrong, right? So I think we need to apply this, the goring ox rule, law in the Bible, does not, the modern equivalent is not just a pit bull, okay, in an unthinking sense, because it's more nuanced than that, right? So, those of you who are lawyers, you are familiar with this term called jurisprudence. And it's really a simple study of the theory or the philosophy of the law, the study of law and how laws operate, right? Good jurisprudence work requires God's people to ask more questions about the law and its application in its original context. If you are going to apply scriptures well, right? Because these scriptures are found in the legal section of the Bible. And to apply them well, you need to understand the historical context under which it was written, why it was written. Maybe it was very specific to a particular culture, a particular thing that was happening at that point of time. We are trying to draw the essence of the law rather than just, the letter of the law or the words which are found inside. It's the same for, I'm a Methodist. Any ex-Methodist or previous Methodist? Bless your soul, brother. But within the Methodist culture, the ordained ministers take a vow not to drink. Okay, I see nobody wants to be a Methodist minister anymore. Okay, but they take a vow not to drink, and you ask yourself, where did that law come from? Where did that vow come from? It goes back to John Wesley's time. And John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, was operating in a situation where drunkenness was a very big part of societal ills. And it caused so many societal issues in the family, etc. Right? But that legacy, for some reason, it has been brought forward into the code of conduct or whatever that those terms are. So Methodist ministers cannot, they actually sign, and they're not supposed to drink. Yeah, whether they break them or not, I'm not sure, but But my point is, has that injunction, that stipulation, been thought through carefully? So there's a lot of murmurs. I know a lot of Methodist ministers, some are, just follow. But for some, they really push back and they really struggle with this, that, hey, why is it within the clergy you're not supposed to drink? Tell me something different about the mic now. Is it better or worse? Better. Okay. Okay, so, it's a bit loud, echoey. A bit echoey now, right? Okay, so anyways, whoever is the IT expert or the AV expert, maybe you can sort it out. Okay, so I'm saying that we are talking about jurisprudence, and we need to think through a little bit more the context behind any specific law. Okay. Now, I want us to be thinking Christians, but I also want us to be a bit more careful about, then you look at this law and you have great arguments with your pastors and leaders about this. Don't do that. You can always have great discussions, but don't do great public discussions. So I'm going to go back to, for us to think that, I just want to leave us with the thought that when we understand, when we have good jurisprudence in our DNA as faithful readers of God's Word, when we want to understand the Scriptures better in its context, I think we will then understand, we'll find that, that God's law was actually written as a positive force. It was written as a vehicle for good. It was actually written as protection for us to be grateful for. It is a joy and a delight to have. And it's really that kind of a spirit that I want us to, begin to approach the law rather than to say, wow, it's so burdensome, which is exactly what it became for the Pharisees as they took the word of God and they made it into an institutional heavy burden to be carried in society. Okay, so we need to get the right frame of mind, the right mindset when it comes to law. It's supposed to be liberating. It's supposed to be protection, particularly for the vulnerable. And that's really how good laws should operate in society, right? A medical doctor in public policy, we had discussion once and he said, good policies and good law save lives, right? Good law will save lives. It will protect those who are vulnerable. And maybe those of us who are privileged, and that's maybe the majority of us, should approach the law that way, not selfishly for ourselves, not to use it against other people in a negative way, but to see that in our hands, and those of us who are in senior positions of leadership, in our hands we have the policy and the protections to help the people in our communities to thrive. Okay, so I want us to think and have that mindset in our spirits, because I think that will help us through in a big way. Okay, so we were talking about the traditional way of classifying the law. And the question that we need to ask is, what is the way forward? All right? And so Duval and Hayes, what they do is they try to introduce us to a consistent approach to interpreting the Old Testament law by exploring the narrative context and the covenantal context of the Old Testament legal material, and then discussing with us the implications of that context to interpretation. Okay, so one is very important, and this is the big takeaway for you all, I hope, is that laws are always embedded in narrative, and laws are also embedded in covenant. And by understanding the role of story and covenant in relation to law, or law in relation to them, I think we will be able to benefit a lot. Okay, so I think this may be a good time for us to take a short break. Maybe 5 minutes, is that okay? And then we'll move on, all right? And then you can have your makan break again.